whatever that's worth. So let's begin. Where do we want to start? This is the last session, and maybe 5 sessions was too long. I just didn't know how to do so many pages in less than this. I thought the reading would be too much for people. But the downside might be that 5 weeks was too long for people to hang in to the very end. Hi, Farouk, nice to have you. And Khalid, you're there. And Xenia, I don't know.
You're muted.
Khalid, you want to turn on your video? And Xenia? And I guess Dorcas must just walked away or something. There you are.
Yeah, I'm here. I just wanted to adjust the light.
Great. Okay. So where do we want to begin tonight? This is the last chapter. So one way to do it is to focus on this last chapter and then go back and tie it all together, or look at the book as a whole from beginning to end today. So as in all the other sessions, I'm happy to take your lead. Whoever wants to start, that will be the beginning, and we'll pick up the thread from there.
I didn't like the ending.
You did not like the ending.
I thought it would be a happy ending.
Well, the name of the book is Where We Started. If you think we're living in a happy time, then it would have been a happy ending. If you see where we are today is less than ideal, it couldn't have been a happy ending. It had to be something less than happy.
Well, you didn't have to knock both of them out. I mean, what?
Well, it's an interesting question, because Joel, who couldn't be here tonight, he says he's really sorry that he can't be, because that was exactly his question. He wanted to know why both died at the end. Why, as he said, why did I kill them? Why did I kill them both? The short answer is I didn't do anything. As I said before, the story takes on a life of its own. This is how it wound up. But so the question is, why? Why both? What's the significance, do you think, of both dying? Neither had to die. It could have been one or the other. So there were multiple possibilities here for the ending. Why both? Well,
it's very tragic. It was tragic. You know, when I read it, it was, first of all, there was a lot of little tragedies throughout the entire book.
That's for sure.
A series of tragic events. It made me feel real bad about the history of this country, you know, and the level that human beings would stoop to, you know, with all these little tragedies going on and the way people had to survive. And, I mean, it pointed out how poison racism really is. It poisons the soul, no matter what color you are. It just poisoned everybody, and the way that went, and the way those two went out after being close is in the youth. You know, they grew up together, and the way the tables turned when one of the brothers invited him back, you know, to try to buy property, you know, at their place of origin, and then he turned on it. So, I mean, it was horrifying. Well, I'm gonna read the book again, by the way. When this thing is over, I'm gonna go through the book again throughout the year and see if I can pick up something else on it. But you know, it wasn't a happy ending, obviously.
Right. So why do you think that James was going to kill Sharper? What was going on there?
It seemed to me that he was mentally, something was cooking. He didn't sound like a healthy guy. He was talking weird. He was all over the place, and he was doing things and seeing things and so on. So from a medical point of view, I thought he had some neurological ailment.
Yeah, and what do you think that was?
It could be neurosyphilis, could be any number of conditions at that time. Who knows?
Well, I do give a reason in the story. It doesn't come out of nowhere.
So
Go ahead.
Yeah, Shireen?
So psychological point of view, I thought James went insane.
He was.
To put it bluntly.
Yes.
And like I saw I don't know if it would be the reason for it, or maybe it was just a small part of why was that it seemed like Sharper moved on with his life from when he was a boy, young man's chance, but James really did not. It seemed like James was stuck in the time of when the two of them were still, I guess, teenagers or young, early 20s or something. And when Sharper didn't want to go back to that time with him, I think he just snapped. At least that's what I got from it.
Okay, Harry?
When James first met Sharper in Brooklyn, you write about his hand, which is of pus when he was putting on his shirt or something.
Right.
That could be an indication that he's getting sick. Something is happening with him. But even when just before he is shot, he's literally challenging him. He calls him epithets and everything. When he talk of spittle running down his mouth, he seemed to be, like Farooq said, not well. It could be pure syphilis or something, But what I found, apart from this killing, was that Sharper really didn't defend himself in court. He just admitted that he shot him, and he didn't say the reason why. He didn't say he was about to shoot me. It's almost as if Sharper had no faith that he would be vindicated or the decision would be in his favor.
Yep, I think at that point, maybe Sharper had given up any hope that things were going to work out. But getting back to what was going on with James, Harry, you said that when he was in Brooklyn, I talk about his finger, right? He goes to the house, and Sharper's daughter says to James, says, what's wrong with your hand there? And he was like, oh no, keep quiet, don't call attention to that. That's rude. And James says, oh no, it's okay. I was out in the woods, and I was chasing my hogs that had run away, and I was bitten by a bat. Okay, so, and his hand is infected, but what is the illness that comes with being bitten by a bat?
Rabies?
It's rabies, right?
Or coronavirus.
Yeah. So he has rabies, and rabies does cause mental illness. You really literally become crazy with rabies. It's one of the effects of rabies. So I think that's what's going on with him. And then if he's bitten by a bat, there's one other reference to bats in the novel. In fact, it's the title of a whole chapter called, was it Bats? What's it called? Bats from Hell? Let me see. Bats of the Wilderness. That's the name of the chapter, is Bats of the Wilderness. Now, I don't expect readers to go back and remember all of that. But for me, these were the connections that were going on here, is that the Bats of the Wilderness chapter is the one where Mingo and Phyllis are betrayed. They went to the church, and they hear the preacher, and the preacher, this black preacher, he takes the phrase from the Bible, the bats of the wilderness, which is, he says, I'll read what part of the sermon was. He says, "We thank thee that the Son of Righteousness has at last shed morning beams upon them. May the nations, which now sit in darkness, behold and rejoice in its light, and grant that all those in false religions cast their idols to the moles and the bats of the wilderness." So that is the sermon that is meant to be uplifting and inspire the people there. Remember, it's a mixed group that he's speaking to. He's a black preacher. He's talking to a mixed group in the church. And he's saying, well, things are getting better, but you better throw your idols, to the moles and to the bats of the wilderness. The bats of the wilderness are terrible creatures. And that yet that's the place in which there's this betrayal about who's going to be freed and who is being granted being emancipated and who isn't. And people think that they are, and they aren't. And it's really, really uncertain, and people are changing their minds, and they're being given, they're being emancipated with all kinds of conditions and restrictions. So it's all very complicated. And at the end, he's bitten by a bat. He's gone into the wilderness to get his hogs, and he gets bitten, and he is literally crazy. And also Dory, I'm sorry, did you want to say something? No, okay. I just saw the screen pop up. I thought that your hand went up too. They go up to Elmira. Oh, and I should say, before I forget, the picture behind me, that is a picture of the house that the last chapter with Uncle Samuel that takes place. And that's based upon a real person, James Jones. And what I described that Samuel does in Elmira is a true story about what James Jones did. That's James Jones's house. So that you could take a look at. This is the house that Sharper and James have gone to, that was built by James Jones, and really nobody knows the origin story of James Jones. He sort of winds up in Elmira, and there are various stories about how he got there. But he was a runaway slave who goes to Elmira to gain his own freedom. And while he's there, he becomes the sexton of the church, and is burying these bodies that he could hardly keep up with, who are dying in the prisoner of war camp. And this prisoner, those of us who are old enough might remember the book called Andersonville, which was a bestseller sometime back in, I guess, the early 60s. And Andersonville was a notorious prison camp that was in the South. Well, the camp in Elmira wasn't a whole lot better. And it was where Confederate soldiers were. And they were just, what I had described there about people paying 10 cents to watch the prisoners of war being tortured. But that's true. I mean, that's all from the historical record. I didn't make any of that up. This was like going to a sporting event. There were bleachers that were set up outside the camp. You could look down into the camp and watch the soldiers being tortured and eating the rats and being held up by their thumbs, and illnesses just swept through the camp, and thousands of soldiers died. And Jones worked at the nearby prison. I think the Kid prison, the cemetery. I think the cemetery is I think it's called Woodlawn. And he was burying both Confederate and Union soldiers. And when he buried the Confederate soldiers, if there were any mementos that they might have had, their ID or a piece of their clothing or a letter, he would bury them and offer a prayer for the Confederate soldiers. And when the war was over, if any of the widows of Confederate soldiers tried to find their dead relatives and contacted him up in the cemetery, he would arrange for the bodies to be sent back so they could be buried in the South. All of this from somebody who was an ex-slave. So I thought that's who Samuel winds up. Now, Eric, last week I think you had said that you thought that Samuel was maybe the only hero in the book. I think there are others. I think. Well,
he was to a certain point, and that was a job. I mean, he took the job. Somebody was going to do the job, so he was just doing the job. But what baffled me though was why you say that James had rabies, but it didn't come out. It didn't come out when they were visiting Mr. Samuel in Elmira. He seemed pretty a normal guy. And both of them seemed normal. It's only when they went back that all of this rabies, the effects of rabies came out, and that's what really baffled me. Why didn't it come out when they were up north?
Well, because sometimes these illnesses take a while to manifest themselves. So I did do some research on rabies and try to make the timeline straight. which is from the time that you're bitten and until the time that you really sort of, lose it, as he does at the end. I try to make that timeline straight. Maybe I fudged it a little bit, but like any illness, I mean, some people have COVID and, it doesn't manifest itself until they really get sick. You don't know. And I assume that was the case here with rabies. But I was asking you, Eric, if you don't mind, last week, you had said that you thought Samuel was the hero and maybe the only hero in the book. And here he goes out of his way. I think he's doing two things. Certainly he's doing his job. And you find out that he really probably is going to wind up as being a wealthy man because he's getting paid so much to bury these soldiers and he can't keep up with it. He's making a small fortune doing this. But he could have done that and that would have been all. Nobody would have asked him to do anything more than that, certainly with the Confederate soldiers. In fact, people would get angry that he was being so considerate. So why would he do that? And when you see him doing that, how do you assess it? Does he make you less of a hero or more of a hero? Are you inspired by this, or are you confused and say, why would you do that? I mean, somebody who is your mortal enemy, somebody who kept you as a slave and now fights to continue slavery, you're now honoring him and how you're burying him. What's going on here? Why are you doing this? Dorcas, unmute, please.
To me, when I read that, I was actually very surprised. It's like vengeance begets vengeance, but he goes above and beyond, making sure that if ever the wives or the family come saying, did you ever, my son or my husband was last here, and I was really very surprised by that. And then in my head, I'm saying, was he doing it as a job, but also hoping that in the end, he will see the kingdom of heaven? It was a way of maybe making his way to the heavens.
Rich?
Yeah, I'm not at the end, but I am at a place, for instance, where there's like a premonition when Samuel was talking to both James and Sharper. He has like this bond with Sharper that indicates that don't trust James as much as you are his brother, and have this wonderful bond. There's a certain amount of trust that should not exist between you. And it showed itself, for instance, in the whole, James did not know that there was a underground railroad, but Sharper did. And he was like a little amazed that James didn't. So there was still a bond among the slaves, former slaves, freed blacks who that existed, and they knew that they couldn't trust, whites of as close as you may have been to them, it seems. And I guess I'll come back again with some other points, but that was one. Oh, yeah, okay, that was it. There was a premonition also. I think that that Samuel might come to, that there might be violence between them. I thought that probably in that same chapter that there was this, there could be harm between the two of you. So watch yourself.
Yeah. Eric?
So, another name for the Civil War is the Brothers' War. It was family against family in a lot of instances where, certain families took the South side, certain families took the North side, obviously. So when I read, Mr. Samuel was burying the Confederate soldiers, I mean, once you're dead, period. Whether you're Confederate, in my opinion, if I put myself in these shoes, I mean, I would basically bury the bodies of these souls equally. I mean, I wouldn't have any hate for the Confederates. At this point, they're dead. Maybe if they're alive, I would, but it's just a dead body now. So why not put everybody, treat the bodies equally? That was heroic in itself. I think he took the higher ground.
Yeah. And he says, Samuel, and when he's asked the question directly, I think Sharper challenges him. Like, what are you doing? How can you do this? And he says, how can I judge them? He says, people have all kinds of reasons why they do things. Some of them might have been desperate. Some of them might have been, they didn't have a choice. Others may have, they just needed the money. Maybe they were fighting to preserve states' rights. Maybe they were fighting to preserve slavery. He says, I don't know. He says, any more than I know what the motives are of the Union soldiers, he says. And remember, because in the previous section in this, in the previous chapter in this section, it is the whites who burned down the what's called the colored orphanage in New York City, because they were opposed to being drafted to go fight for the Union. When they say, what are we fighting for the Union for? I mean, why are we risking our lives? So that for all of those blacks in the South, who, if they become free, they're going to come here and take our jobs away. We're not. This isn't our war. This is, maybe it's Lincoln's war. Maybe the blacks should go fight. And this is the draft riot in New York. Again, that whole section about burning down the orphanage, all of that's from the historical record. That's exactly what happened. And those are the real names of the people who were involved in all of that in New York. So, and we don't get much of that or any of that really in our history, how much the war was opposed in the North by whites, especially the working class whites. And the abolitionists had their agenda, which was a principled one, mainly, but even there it was, for some, not so principled, but mainly the abolitionists were principled. Who knows why people were fighting? And that's what he says. He says, I'm not the judge. He says, that for the judgment is for God, not for me. I'll bury them. But after having said that, he's sort of, if I could say, almost like a twinkle in his eye, or maybe a slight smirk. He says, and besides, look how much I'm getting paid. It's like, yeah, I'm principled, but you know what? I'm getting paid besides. And having said that, makes you wonder, well, which is the stronger motive with him? Or the fact that most of us have mixed motives most of the time.
Yeah,
Very seldom do we have pure motives.
A black man getting that kind of money that he was getting during those days, I don't blame him. Take it. Yeah,
and he did.
Yes, sir. I'll take that job.
Yeah, and the real James Jones, he wound up being a pretty wealthy guy. Now, talking about Samuel and his motives, not so dissimilar, I don't think, from Junius Morrill. Do you remember the whole business with Junius Morrill? He was Sharper's father-in-law. And there's all these conversations that he has when Sharper first goes to Brooklyn, and he meets Isabel, Belle's father, Junius Morrill. Junius Morrill starts out, you learn, having been very much opposed to colonization. When colonization was first proposed, and you might remember going back even prior to that in the book, there's all this discussion about colonization in the around the War of 1812. And he was very much opposed to that. And this is based upon a real character. There really was a Junius Morrill in Brooklyn, and there really was a Weeksville. And Junius Morrill was opposed to that. But as time went by, and then again during the war, he says, well, maybe not colonization exactly, but we really can't stay in the cities. You need to leave. You need to make it on your own. You need to be self-sufficient. You're never going to be self-sufficient in the city. You'll always be sort of the laboring class. You need to go back and be your own person, go and farm. And he says, lots of places you can go. You can go to Canada. You can go to Haiti. You can go out west where the government was giving away land. There are many places you can go, but get out of here, Sharper. Don't stay in Brooklyn. And then when he's up in Elmira and is talking to Samuel, Samuel says, Well, I was given land up here by an abolitionist up in the mountains. He says, I'm not there because how can you farm? What can you do up there? It's not, you really can't farm. It's not good farming country. So I stayed here in Elmira, but I got the land because I was able now to be a full citizen. I was able to vote. Blacks were not allowed to vote unless they owned land. So abolitionists were buying land and giving it to them so they could be landowners. And I mean, with all of these things, all these mixed messages, Sharper is being told by Samuel, you know, be your own man, own land. I'll arrange for you to get something up here in the Adirondacks. And his father-in-law is saying to him, don't stay in Brooklyn, go someplace else, but get out of here where you can be self-sufficient and on your own. And Sharper takes up the challenge and decides, where's the best place for me to go? The war is going to be over soon. That seems to be inevitable. The South is going to lose. Slavery is going to be abolished. He can go back to Delaware, the South County in Delaware, where, as I describe it in the very last chapter, it really has become desolate. I mean, people were leaving. It really was, the farming there wasn't so terrific, and it was becoming depopulated. Farms were being abandoned. So it was possible to go back there and get land at a very decent price if you're willing to work it. And he says, this is where I grew up. Sure, let me go back there. I'll take my chances. Wherever I am, I'm taking my chances. I go up north and there's slave catchers. So, what's that worth? I may as well go back down the place that I know. And he says, there are so many, this is a place where I could live where most people around me will be like me. Most people there were Black. Southern County was predominantly Black. And he says, this is the place I'm going to go. So it wasn't an absurd choice that he was making. I don't know how many people reading it thought that he was making the right choice. Before you got to the end, of course, when you know how it works out. But before then, did you think that this was a reasonable thing for him to do? Was it a wise thing for him to do?
I thought it was a good idea overall.
So you were saying to Sharper, go for it, Sharper.
Yeah, I thought so until his brother turned on him.
Yeah. Well, did his brother turn on him? If you see that it was rabies and he was really rabid at that point, and he really was, I don't know if you call it a mental illness. I'm not sure what you call it when you're infected that way by rabies, but clearly he was not thinking straight. This wasn't him in a way. This is something else had taken over. And what came out was all of these quotes from when they were reading the juvenile miscellany when they were kids. And remember, he was being teased about being the burnt boy. And that's what and that comes up, and this is what he's shouting at Sharper now, that you're the burnt boy. And then he also quotes from the poem, The Lame Horse. And I don't know if anybody went back and reread the story of the lame horse. I actually quote it in a much earlier, not just make reference to it, but I actually quote the story earlier in the book. And the lame horse is this horse that says, it's lame, and it says, please shoot me. He asks to be killed. The lame horse asks to be killed. And if you see it, if you put it together with that story, and James is now referring back to, when he was a teenager, and that story about the lame horse, which was an important story to them, you could see that James is asking Sharper to kill him. James is the lame horse at this point. And he's picking up this pistol and saying to Sharper, shoot me, kill me.
But Sharper had I'm sure if Sharper had any clue that the man was sick, that he had rabies, he could have easily walked away. But he baited him into a racial
yes, he did.
Racial event, right? And Sharper already had a sense of racial pride throughout the story. He always he was aware that the black man couldn't do this. You know, he had no rights here. He was treated this way, no legal rights. So he was baited for the most part. He didn't recognize that the brother was sick. So you know, under those conditions, you know, he shot him, and he had no right after he shot him to shoot a white man during those days. Forget about the legal system, whether you're right, wrong, or indifferent. He could have fought any way, 2 ways that he wanted to. He was going to get hung in the end anyway.
Well, that's right, and I think that that's why he pretty much keeps quiet. And I say there that the law did not allow a black person to testify against a white one. So what was he going to say? Well, he had no defense here. So he just said, okay, that's the way it's going to be. I wouldn't say it's fatalism exactly, but it's maybe finally you know that you don't have any more options. Was I going to say something about James? Oh, why didn't Sharper just walk away? And why did Sharper pull the trigger at the end and shoot James?
Because James was about to shoot him. It was also self-defense.
Yeah, that's how I saw it. Initially, James was shocked by Sharper was shocked by James. He didn't walk away because he says, "What the hell's going on here? I don't understand this." And he's trying to talk to him reasonably. And when he begins to walk away, that's Sharper. James picks up the pistol and begins to count. And he says, "Stop! What are you doing? What are you counting?" And he's ready to say 3, and Sharper realizes that if he doesn't shoot him, James was going to shoot him. James was out of his mind at that point. Yeah, Rich?
Oh, I'm sorry. Lynn has her hand up.
Lynn has her hand
I
up.
didn't say.
Yeah.
Lynn.
Well, one of the messages that I got from that whole scene is how deeply, deeply entrenched racism is. That even though these 2 boys played together, they loved each other, James turned racist. James saw him as black and saw him as an enemy. There was no recognition that this was his pal at that point. So it felt like a metaphor to me.
You stole my thunder, Lynn. But I was wondering if rabies wasn't a metaphor or a symbol for racism.
Yeah.
You know, that because, it was clear even in an earlier part of the book, which I'm more familiar with, but, he somewhere you have a line, that he couldn't express the anger towards James. It was when Samuel was arrested for doing the Underground Railroad, I'm going to call it, and James was supposed to buy him and was outbidded, and Sharper had this anger, and the line is that he couldn't, that a black person could not express towards a white person, as close as they were, it could not be expressed. So I'm continually amazed at current events, all these acts of violence, Black Lives Matter, of not the resilience, but I guess it's based on reality that black persons stay nonviolent. I mean, there's so many times that I've said to myself, I feel like taking up arms. My wife calls it, taking one for the team, because at my age, I'm not giving up that much. But I'm always amazed at convicts come out of, after having spent 35 years in prison, and then DNA says they're innocent, and they're released, and they're not like wanting to shoot down the DA and anybody else that was involved in that conviction. So yes,
that certainly comes up a number of times over maybe in each generation. There's this discussion: what's the best way to respond? If you respond with violence, what good is that going to get you, since you're probably going to be on the losing end of it?
Right.
If, on the other hand, you don't express it, what does that do to your self-esteem? So then maybe the choice is just leave the situation completely. That is, go to Liberia, go to Canada, go to the Caribbean, where you can get out of the situation. Well, what good is that going to do? Because then you have as much right to be here as anybody else, and stake your claim and make your claim. So all of the arguments, I think, that we have today in society have been the arguments since the very beginning. And every generation tries to answer these questions in its own way. There's one other thing, though, about James and Sharper. When James and Sharper in Elmira, and it's the end of the evening, they go upstairs, they go to sleep. And again, not uncommonly, I mean, it was actually very typical at that point, is that people shared beds. That really was typical. Certainly, if people went to an inn or a tavern and they were sleeping, you slept in the same bed with a stranger. I mean, the idea of comfort and privacy and so forth, that's a relatively new idea. So here, James and Sharper are in bed together, as they often shared beds when they were kids. And James turns and strokes Sharper's cheek and goes to hug him. And Sharper says to him, "Cut it out. We're not boys anymore." And James is rebuffed by Sharper at that point. Do you think that could account for why, when he's kind of mad with the rabies, crazy because of rabies, the thing that would come into his head to say to James will be all the things that go back to their childhood, when it was okay for them to sleep together. And now Sharper's rejected him. He's rejected him in a way that for James is now maybe not understandable. He's never been rejected that way before. I mean, they would argue, they would get into fights with one another, but everything throughout the book was that they always remained very close, and they lived together, they shared beds together, as the kids did. So I was wondering whether that was part of what was going on with James at the end, and why he turned on Sharper as radically as he did. But I see somebody has something in the chat room here. What is it? Oh, somebody says right here. Okay. All right. Any thoughts about this?
So, Arthur, what you just said about James being rebuffed by Sharper,
Yep.
and that's what I was that was part of what I was referring to with how Sharper moved on from what they did as kids and became more adult-like, but it seems like James had not. And so I think that was a big part of how James psychologically snapped at Sharper, because he got rejected by someone he was to be close to.
Right. And he just wanted to hug him, and James wouldn't, and Sharper wouldn't let him. Rich?
Well, yeah, I hate to keep talking, but I think it's also part of the racism, though, issue, because James was always in control, so I'm not sure whether, Sharper put up with things that maybe he wouldn't have put up with if he felt he had the power or the independence to do that, until they were up in New York and could. So, I think maybe I'm thinking that part of that problem is the changes that were occurring that, in some deeper level, affected James in ways that he really didn't realize, that he lost control, he lost dominance, he lost, the upper hand in their relationship.
Yep. No, I think you're right, Rich. I think all of these things are true. I think that, again, motivations are very complicated, and why people do what they do is I think it's often a mistake to reduce people's motivations, why people do things, to just one thing. That kind of reductionism, I think, is often incorrect. There are often multiple motivations why people do things, which is why I suppose that when you get to a criminal trial and you have the defense and the prosecuting lawyers arguing, they each present a different picture of the same event. And they both may be right. I mean, and that's for the jury to sort out which one is more right or which one is less right than the other. Okay, we finished with this last chapter here. I don't know if there's any more to say. Is you want to say anything about Brooklyn and Weeksville? Did anybody know anything about Weeksville? I know one person here knew something about Weeksville before, but I didn't know if this was all news to people, that this is Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn, and Crow Hill is Crown Heights. Crown Heights is on the Heights. It's the same terminal moraine that you find that goes throughout the rest of Long Island. When you go north of Jericho Turnpike here in Nassau County, it becomes hilly. That's the terminal moraine. And it goes into Brooklyn as well. Brooklyn Heights, Crown Heights, that's all the same. This is as far south as the glacier went. And then when the glacier began to retreat, it became flat south of that because of all the water, pulverizing everything. And north of, it tore up the land and left all the rocks, and it becomes hilly. So anyhow, so where Weeksville is, if anybody has gone down what's now called the Jackie Robinson Parkway, what used to be called the Interborough Parkway, and when you get to the end of it, you're at the top of a hill there, and that's the terminal moraine. And if you make a right turn and go down the streets a little bit, that's Weeksville is around there. Weeksville was virtually forgotten about until I think the 1970s or so, when somebody was looking at an aerial photograph, an historian was looking at an aerial photograph of the area and says, "What's that down there?" And you could pick out the remnants of this virtually disappeared village. And they began to excavate, and it's now a museum in Brooklyn that's open a couple of days a week. And a few of the houses remain. Most of it was torn down and replaced by the projects in Ocean Hill, Bedford-Stuyvesant area. But that's where it was. And it was an independent, a self-sufficient Black community. And Junius Morell was there, and he established the colored school number 2. And it was integrated. It was such a good school that there were white parents who wanted to send their kids there. And the Board of Education in Brooklyn wanted to shut it down because they said we can't have Black and white kids going to school together. My imagination as a writer could not keep up with the stuff that I was finding as an historian. It's like, oh my God, I just can't believe it. This is really true. And all the stuff about Delaware, where the governor was really supporting slavery and Confederacy in Delaware, but was constantly outvoted by the others, is also true. Yeah. What, Lynn?
Dory has her hand raised.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know why, but the people who have their hands up always shows up in my left-hand corner, upper left-hand corner, and that's where I never look that way.
Well, why don't you start looking that way, Arthur?
That direction.
Well, when I got to Junius Morell, I was so excited because, of course, me having read This Red Land, I was like, wow, I meet them again. So that was really wonderful, even though it's two different people in one. So I'm saying in my head, is that how they got reincarnated? But that's just me. That's all.
Oh, it wasn't just you, Dory. The book that Dorcas is referring to is the previous novel, which is called This Red Land. And one of the 3 main characters in that book is Junius, who grows up in Weeksville, and he's named after Junius Morell. So yes, that is a connection. And maybe at some point, if anybody is interested, we could do that book, which is a lot easier reading than this one was. It's really contemporary. So what else here? Yes, Kevin. Kevin, I thought I saw your hand go up.
Bob has his hand up now, Arthur.
Or maybe, yeah, that's really strange. You're upper left-hand corner again. Go ahead.
Yeah. So Arthur, I have a sort of stylistic question for you.
Yeah.
So, I read the book on Kindle, and I'm a little bit obsessive compulsive, so I always keep highlights. And so I would highlight the good quotes or the facts about slavery in orange, but every time suddenly somebody died in one sentence, I would start to highlight them in blue. And I ended up with a lot of blue highlights. It got me thinking that there should be a subtitle for the book, Where We Started, and How Suddenly We Ended. So, same thing that held true right to the end, where all of a sudden you have somebody saying, did you kill Mr. James Preddy? And I'm thinking to myself, whoa, another one bites what's up with that? The only person who really got a good send-off actually was Sharper. You gave him like 3 or 4 sentences. It was kind of grisly. But, you at least gave some definition or some description of what happened to him. So my question is a style question. Was it that you were trying to emphasize the ways in which slavery and the times cheapened lives, or that you just didn't like describing death? There was so many people who died very suddenly, like in one sentence or maybe 2 at tops. So I was wondering what your structural thinking was there.
The answer is both of those things, Bob. One is that it really was to emphasize how death was so prevalent and could come and strike people so quickly and unexpectedly, and how ubiquitous it was. It didn't matter if you were a newborn, it didn't matter if you were 30, it didn't matter what age. One day you're perfectly happy and the next day you die from an infection. One day you're perfectly happy, you break your leg and you can't walk any longer, you're lame and you fall down and you die. You hit your head. So I think that most people just did die very suddenly. That's one. The other was, and it was to emphasize that. The other was a style, I had to make a decision. Since there were lots of people in the book, and this takes place over 120 years approximately, over 4 generations, 5 generations, almost everybody who was in this book is dead by the end. And so I had to say something about them, otherwise it's like they just totally disappeared. So it would be when you get on to the chapter after Nan, it's like, well, so whatever happened to Nan? Well, Nan died in a fire. And you get into another chapter and William isn't there any longer. What happened to William? Well, William died from syphilis, right? And it was like just a sentence or 2. I don't think that people dwelt on it. And when people died, it was, we'll just get on with their lives. It was not uncommon for men to be married 2-3 times. You married when you were 20, your wife gave birth and she died in childbirth. So you're 23 years old and you're a widow, so you marry a second time. Your second wife, she gets an infection in childbirth and she dies, and you're a widow at 40, you marry again. So I think that that's how life was. I may be completely wrong. I mean, if I were in a time machine and went back, I might find that people really had different attitudes, and I'm sure not everybody, of course, not everybody was the same. But so the answer was both, Bob. It was to underscore the fragility of life, the tenuousness of life. But it was also a decision stylistically, not to spend a whole lot of time just talking about people dying, because since there were so many people, they would have made the book twice as long, and it was long enough. Yeah, hold on, Rich. Let's see if there's anybody else. Wayne, I know when you were here, I think the first session, you said, was I going to say anything about Indians?
Yeah.
right? And the second session was, and I don't know if you wanted to say something about that before we're done tonight, or is that so far back that it doesn't matter any longer?
Well, I don't remember, but I had exactly the comment that Bob did in the first meeting about it's just suddenness of a character you've been reading about for pages and pages and pages, and then suddenly in one sentence he's gone. And I even made the comment that, you know, sometimes it wasn't even a new paragraph, it just kept going.
Yeah.
And I noticed that, and I commented on that. And so you gave a fuller explanation now, which I appreciate. There were two parts to that, but certainly, yeah, I think life was much more expendable. Well, it's expendable now in some places like Ukraine and many other places in the world. But compared to our Western sensibilities, I think it was just much more expendable or viewed that way. And I mean, you know, just in my own family, both of my grandparents had several children that died as infants, and that, you know, that was just the way it was. And they had a bunch of them, and more of them survived than died. And there was nothing unusual about that. It was upsetting to the families, of course, but so anyway, I don't remember, what was your question about the second?
You had mentioned, you had wondered whether if there was going to be any references to the Indians. Since
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and then I missed that one because I ended up having to work.
Right.
I had a client crisis that week. Yeah, and then I did read that whole section about the Indians. But I've forgotten now what I would want to say about that.
I think you just only had a question about whether whether they would be included in the book,
Yes.
whether they would be overlooked.
Yes.
Yeah, and they had to be included because that was a significant part of the early life in this part of the country.
Right.
Look left, Arthur.
Oh, Khalid, thank you.
Yeah, the hand is about the same color as my background, so I didn't know if you saw it or not. Yeah, just a few comments. You know, there was another community in Central Park, where Central Park is located, was a Black community that they destroyed. And the other comment I wanted to make was in regards to what Richard was talking about, kind of not understanding why there's not more violent reactions to the injustices. I wanted to make the statement that nobody brings a violent dog into their house as a pet. One of the things that the explorers that came and explored America and also Africa, the comments of the explorers were that we were a very simple people, a very childlike, simple people. And they said the same thing about the Indians, that we were childlike, very trusting, very happy, very docile. So there's something about the nature of the people that were subjugated, that those who subjugated them saw something in their nature where they were not violent. And that's why they saw them as fit to be victims. If they were violent, they would have never brought them into their homes and into their environment. But what they saw were very docile people who really could not imagine what was going on in the heads of those Europeans, because they just were so far away from that. And that's still part of our nature. We're not violent people, but what's been done is what the boys in the street say. They flipped the script on us. And so what they have put in the world is that Black people are violent and white people have been made to be very peaceful looking and very, very non-threatening. But in reality, in the world and in the history, what really happened was just the opposite. So I wanted to make that comment.
Thank you.
Yeah. Harry.
Something which Khalid said reminded me of an incident in history in South America. The Aztec chief was actually invited by the conquistadors, and he trusted them, and he went and he met them, and they surrounded him and they tied him down, and they massacred just the entire population there. But talking about Indians, one of the most horrific and horrible episodes in the book is when those 20 Indians, which you describe as the last of their tribe, the Conestogas, I think that's the pronunciation, or that's the name, if I remember correctly. And they were massacred by the Braxton boys, who just wanted them to be exterminated and finished. Those guys were not doing anything to them. They had no weapons, and they were just wiped out. But one strand throughout the book, Arthur, and I'd like to ask you, is we hear about this statement that racism is the wound that never heals. And throughout this book, that wound is never healed, right? No doubt there was emancipation. And how can we heal this wound? It's a very major question in our times, And another point before you answer that question, I'll quickly be brief about another question I wanted to ask you. Throughout the book, you have never once mentioned dates, yet you give markers. Like you give Frederick Douglass's speech, "What to a Slave is the 4th of July," which he spoke in the Corinthian Hall in Rochester, And you speak about the Emancipation Proclamation, you speak about John Brown. You give dates, but without actually giving the dates. Is that, did you do that on purpose, or could you have inserted a few dates once in a few years, like once in a way?
No, it was deliberate. It's not. It's not consciously to make it harder for a reader but I don't want to just signal things to let people know, to make it easy. I think of in telling a story, in writing a book, and writing a novel, and you meet a character, and I meet the characters. I have some notion about them, but not a whole lot. And then it's revealed to me. I mean, whether it's my subconscious or whatever is prompting this, but they don't signal to me, and they don't. When you meet somebody, they don't say, "Oh, I was born in 1956." You see somebody, and you get to know somebody, and they tell you about things that happened, and you realize, oh yeah, well they were born, during the Civil Rights era, or something like that. So I want to tell stories that way, and not by waving flags and raising banners and say, okay, this is now 1956. And I also, my descriptions of people tend to be pretty spare. I don't, this may be my own personal preference, when I'm reading a book, I don't really want to have a strong image drawn for me by the writer. I would rather just have some broad hints, like he's tall, he has broad shoulders, he has big hands, or he has a beard, or whatever it might be. And then I'd like picturing for myself what that person might be like. I suppose it's like maybe a director in a movie. They have a script, and one director may choose one kind of person, and the director may choose somebody who looks very, very different. I mean, it can't be totally different, but we all have our image. If we were asked, each of us was asked to pick out one person here and say and describe this person, we probably would all come up with slightly different descriptions of the person. You might say the person has long hair or no hair, or white hair. Or you might say the person is, whatever. But there's probably going to be lots of differences. And I'd like doing that as the writer. I'm going to leave it up to the reader to fill in what they think the person really looks like. So those are choices, Harry. Farouk.
I don't even recall the last time I was taught about rabies. I'm glad that that information came through today after, I don't know, med school 50 years ago. We might have had a short lesson on rabies. But this was very interesting connection. And I almost forgot about Kwasi and Sally, the ones who started this whole thing. And this journey was a fascinating journey. And I got a lot out of it, got a good feel for what life was like at that time. And I'm glad I wasn't around at that time. And all the complexities, the interactions between the different groups, the different ethnicities, and what came out of that. So I want to thank you for leading us on this long journey. And I think we all came out a little wiser at the end. So I appreciate your time, patience, and your guiding this whole session.
Well, thank you, Farouk. That sounds like the closing words for the night. Is that right? Are there any more comments here? Anybody
Yes,
want?
I could keep talking unless it's coming to an end. 8:30, the projected time? Or?
Yeah, we're scheduled for 8:30. Before we
Okay.
close up, I just want to ask people one favor. I did send out an email and mention this in the email. If you would be kind enough to write a review on Amazon or someplace like that, if you're so inclined, it would be the publisher would love this. I mean, it's and I say that particularly because there's a publisher in Kenya, and we're not talking about some big multi-corporation where this is one of 1,000 writers, and it's the publishing industry outside of Western countries and advanced economies is very difficult. So whatever books he could sell helps to support the publishing industry in Kenya. For me, it doesn't really matter. I actually don't take the royalties. I make sure that they go to people that are friends in Kenya. So the money all stays there. But for the sake of not this book particularly, but it'd be nice to read some of your comments, but to support the publishing industry in Kenya, I'd appreciate that. And reviews could help. I mean, I have no idea how much they help. Who reads them, it doesn't make any difference, but they don't hurt, put it that way.
Arthur, I haven't had much luck. The last 2 reviews I wrote for other books, they were rejected by Amazon. I don't know why. It was just a kind of a regular positive review of some books, and they said, this doesn't meet with our standards, whatever their standards are.
Oh, I have no idea.
Wow.
I have no idea what that is.
Never heard of that.
Yeah,
Did you buy the books from Amazon?
yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Books I had purchased, and I wrote I usually do after I read a book, I write a brief review, but I'll certainly try again and see if I can succeed this time.
I don't know.
Maybe I'll push the rabies piece, that might get you.
Oh, so turning back to the rabies, I saw the rabies as being a metaphor for racism. That's really what it was. He was infected with racism.
Yeah.
And so it was a metaphor for that. So who would ask that? Harry, you would ask the question, like, how do we solve a problem like racism? Who knows? I mean, nobody's come up with an answer yet, but if you see it as an illness, as an infection, then in the way that we've been able to pretty much eliminate rabies, I mean, very few people are afraid of getting rabies any longer, and even if you do, it's no longer fatal. We've gotten rid of lots of illnesses. Somebody comes along and says, let's see if this will work. And sometimes most things don't. And with racism, like, nothing has yet, but that doesn't mean that it'll always be this way. But I have no idea what the
Arthur, if I could make a comment on that, growing up in Kashmir, we had no Afro-Americans there, 0. However, all the textbooks that I read in my childhood depicted the African people as what Khalid was mentioning, just the opposite of that. Violent, crude. And now I come here and I read about the history of Africa and all the kingdoms that came out of there and all the stuff that came out of the continent of Africa. And what I'm getting at is that the history has been so distorted around the globe, in a northern part of India, in a place of Kashmir, the things we got taught had nothing to do with reality. It was all made up, all wrong, all false. And as a result, that's how your mind is made up. I mean, that was my impression when I arrived here. And so basically, I don't know what the solution is, but it starts in childhood, basically. Nobody's born as a racist. They're basically taught through action, through family, through literature, and through propaganda, whatever.
Shireen wants to talk.
Shireen?
So, for those of you who don't know, I'm in education as a profession. I'm also in counseling as a profession. My answer to what, how do we combat racism? You gotta educate people about the differences, and not just the differences, but also the similarities, like how all these people, yeah, we might look different, yeah, we might eat different things, but we still have some similarities within us too. Like, I feel, well, earlier in my career, I was dealing with a lot of diverse issues because I was more mental health counseling, and like, how do I deal with, whether it was racism in the workplace because I was getting adult students, or just racism in the classroom. Like, and how do these kids deal with these comments that are coming at them when they didn't, they were born and raised here. So I feel like it boils down to educating people.
I don't know if there's one answer. There certainly isn't one answer to this. But each of us does whatever we can. Some of us it's education. For some of us it's politics. Some of us it may be medicine. Other people it might be being a good neighbor and shopping for somebody. Who knows? I mean, if each of us does what we can, and if each of us is willing to be educated by what more needs to be done and maybe what we're even doing wrong that we think that we're doing right, then I haven't lost hope. I hope the book doesn't leave you thinking that I feel hopeless. I don't feel hopeless. I just think that, knowing our history more accurately is at least one small step in making things better. And if this book did that, then I'm happy. I'm pleased.
You have Khalid. Khalid, did you newly raise your hand? Okay, then Rich.
Yeah, I was going to say, yes, similar to what Shireen said, which is, I call it contributions of the human family curriculum. That's what's needed to be taught in schools, so that the children from K to 12 are not being taught about any particular race of people being superior, but actually showing the contributions that have been made by people all over the world, whether it's from India, from Africa, from China, from Europe. What have been the contributions of the human family? Because what has been done is white supremacy has been put all over the world. And so most people want to be white, even if they don't admit it. So that's why the more bleaching cream is being sold in Africa, because people are bleaching their skin. And that's why you see a lot of the entertainers with blonde wigs, African-American women with blonde wigs, so that white supremacy thing is going all over the world. And so we need to have a new curriculum so that the new generation will learn the contributions of all of humanity, and began to do away with the white supremacy idea.
Okay, was it Rich who was next or Harry? Rich?
Yeah, just a quick reply, Khalid. I mean, I think it was back in the 50s, Kenneth Clark did his famous black doll, white doll study and how black children preferred the white doll. So I can't believe that we're still dealing with that issue. You know, we had that whole generation of, you know, black is beautiful and everything else, but apparently it's still out there. And as far as the education goes, I mean, there is a whole half of our country who wants to suppress truth of slavery, of racial relations, of critical race theory. And we are in a tremendous battle as a society in terms of who's going to win out. You know, is the South going to rise again? And is all that hate? I mean, I remember growing up in the 60s and for the first time learning that we had apartheid in this country. Now, you know, I should have known better. I did know better. I mean, I remember my parents telling me stories about white water fountains and black water fountains and banks with white lines and black lines. So, you know, it's incredible that we're still fighting this battle, but it must be fought at every different way. I just wanted to point out a couple of things, which I, you know, at the beginning of the session, before it started, I said to Arthur, this should be a high school textbook as a literature or as history, but there's a few great quotes. You have a discussion going on between James and Sharper about lies, little lies, big lies. When it's federal government, you can't break the law actually. And then Sharper says there's a higher law and slave owners are the ones breaking the law.
Mm.
And I just found that such a powerful sentence. And there's several other different places, but I'm talking too much.
Harry?
Sharp was very much influenced by Frederick Douglass, I think. He keeps quoting him, and a lot of his references, what Rich mentioned just now, are also Frederick Douglass's arguments. If you read his autobiography, you see something very similar to Sharper's point of view. But you make a reference to the bubble in the ocean, that race relationships are like a bubble in the ocean, and then one storm comes and the bubble bursts. I think that's what you put. So that was a very interesting metaphor that you used, Arthur. But I want to ask you one question. What was the reference to Lincoln's toe?
Well,
Sharper says, I'll have to kiss Lincoln's toe. What does that mean?
well, he wasn't going to bow down to Lincoln and do what Lincoln wanted to do, which was to swear allegiance. He said, I don't need to swear allegiance. I'm not going to bow down to him. I'm not going to kiss his foot.
Okay.
Eric, did you want to say something?
Yes, I just wanted to say racism and institutional discrimination walk hand in hand. So I think institutional discrimination is a larger issue that affects the races.
Yep.
But I wanted to just an example. When I started working with Verizon almost 30 years ago, and I was a manager there for 30 years, and I met other managers, white managers that were raised right here on Long Island from Levittown and Bethpage. Got to know them well over the years. On the golf course, they admitted that, you know, I'm the first black guy that they ever socialized with. They never met any other black people. They saw them, you know, in the mall, but they never knew them on a personal basis. And that kind of shocked me, especially in New York.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a new book out called Beyond Bilal. And what the brother is dealing with, Mustafa Briggs, he's dealing with how, even in Islam, how racism has been affected Islam across the world. And so the reason he entitled the book Beyond Bilal is because before he became a scholar in Islam, he only heard a couple of names that were mentioned throughout Muslim history, which was Bilal, the one who called the Muslims to prayer and was the first to call what they call the Adhan, which calls all Muslims to prayer. He was the one that was the first to call to recite that Adhan. And then there was one other Black African that they mentioned in Islamic history. But as he learned about Islamic history himself and studied more, he began to find out that Prophet Muhammad was surrounded by Black people, you know, and he did the research and started coming up with all the names of all these Africans that were around Prophet Muhammad. And then he found out that the woman who raised him was an African, that his mother and father had died, and she raised him from the time he was a child, and he called her Ummi, mama, you know. And so then he talked about Hagar, the one who was the one who found the location of the Kaaba, was a Black woman from Africa. And so he does all this research in this book called Beyond Bilal, Black History in Islam. And so, but the point he makes is that people need to learn about it. The Muslims who are not Black need to learn because they don't know it. And then we need to know it as Black Muslims or Muslims who are Black because we don't know it. So that's the extent that racism has gone around the world. It's not only among Europeans, it's even in the religions. I mean, and the biggest example of that is the Caucasian image of God, which in the form of what Rome put out as Jesus Christ in the Caucasian image. Even though he was raised in Africa and born in Africa, you know, in the area of Africa, he turned out under Constantine as a European and put all over the world. So that when you really get to the core of racism, that's one of the biggest issues, is that the image of God throughout the world for many people is a Caucasian man.
Okay, Farouk, now do you want to have your closing words again?
Here,
Okay, go ahead.
yeah. Well, it's been at times a very heavy discussion. At times it's been lively. At times it's been informative. It's been everything to get put together. And what can I say? I mean, you led the way. It's been very educational for me personally, and I'm sure for others also. And it's brought a new kind of an outlook to. I never went to class here in college or anything like that, but it was great attending a professorial lecture for 5 evenings and being walked through different things and thinking deeply about this issue and that issue and so on. In medicine, it's, you know, we see something, we decide and we move on. We don't kind of give it such a broad kind of a look and take our time. We should, but we don't. And so all in all, it was a wonderful experience, Arthur. Thank you. And Lynn, as a supporting person, pointing out the upper left corner all the time.
I get paid extra for that, I know.
Well, I want to thank you, Farouk, for making this possible, you know, supporting it through the Interfaith Council and promoting it there. I love doing this, and it's very gratifying for me to have a number of people who voluntarily, there are no grades here, nobody paid to be here. You're not going to lose anything if you don't show up. For people to stick with it and find that it's worthwhile. So I thank you all for taking this journey with me. And maybe on some other later in the year, maybe we'll do another program. We'll figure out what that might be.
Yep. Thank you, Arthur. Appreciate it.
Thank you for taking on.
Thank you.